All right, so we're diving into something pretty big today. Uh, Something we don't really talk about that much, like out in the open. It's about the struggles that a lot of young men are going through right now. You might have seen that video, the masculinity debate that's going around, and we're going to be looking at that, plus this Lost Boys report. It's kind of sensitive territory, but I think it's super important if we want to understand like where we're headed as a society.
Yeah, no doubt. And some of the data in there is pretty hard hitting. The video starts off with these like stark facts,
Mm-hmm.
things like young women now out earning young men.
Yeah.
And in the UK, there's been this like 40% increase in unemployed or uneducated guys between 16 and 24. That's a huge shift.
Yeah. And then they go on to talk about this link, which is kind of uncomfortable to think about, between women making more money and divorce rates going up.
Mm.
Makes you wonder about like all the traditional roles and how they're changing.
For sure. It definitely raises questions about expectations in relationships, how they're evolving. And then you have the Lost Boys report, right? That one highlights this bigger trend where young guys are facing difficulties in a bunch of areas. Their performance in school, like the suicide rates are alarmingly high, having trouble finding steady jobs, and even getting caught up in crime.
Yeah.
These aren't just isolated incidents. It feels like it's pointing to something deeper, something more systemic.
Exactly. The main argument of the Lost Boys report is something that really stuck with me. Too many guys aren't getting the guidance, the structure, that sense of purpose that they need. And it's something they desperately need to figure out adulthood, right?
Yeah, totally. And to really get into this, we've got two really interesting perspectives that we're going to look at. First, there's Logan, who's a behavioral scientist and a dating coach, so he's got a unique take on all this.
Right. And Logan has been talking about this dating crisis, this big mating gap where what women are looking for and what men are offering, it's not lining up. And of course, that makes people worry about marriage rates dropping and people having fewer kids.
And then we have Drew, who brings in all this data, which is super helpful. They worked at Hinge for years. They've done tons of research on dating trends. So they're bringing a really analytical perspective. Plus, they have a personal connection to these issues, which I think adds a lot.
For sure. And the big question that they pose right at the beginning of the video is what we're going to try to figure out. What's that first thing that happens? Like that first domino that falls that pushes a guy down this path? So let's unpack all of this. And I think a good place to start is education. Richard Reeves did this research, and he pointed out that boys, they're often starting off behind girls, even in academics.
And what's interesting is how this could be tied to the fact that vocational training in schools has basically disappeared. Like, remember shop class?
Yeah.
Wood shop, auto shop, all that stuff. Those were really solid paths to middle-class jobs for guys who weren't planning on going to a four-year college. But those options are pretty much gone now. So what happens to all those guys who aren't on a traditional college track?
That's a huge question. Like, where are our priorities when it comes to education? Think about this. Women make up something like 70% of valedictorians. They're way more likely to be in the top 10% of their class. But when you look at SAT scores, men and women are pretty much equal. So what's going on in schools? Could it be that the way things are set up now, it just unintentionally favors certain ways of learning?
Yeah, it's possible. And it's really important that we celebrate all the progress that women have made in education and just in general over the past 50 years. The message that girls have been getting that you can be anything, dream big, it's had a huge positive impact, no doubt.
Totally. But it kind of feels like in some ways, boys got left behind a little bit. And it's important to understand this isn't like a competition. One gender winning doesn't mean the other one has to lose. Having these narrow ideas about what it means to be a man, it hurts everybody in the end. You see women frustrated with the guys they're dating, and you see guys feeling lost and confused about what women expect.
Right. It's a mess all around.
Hmm.
And I think another huge piece of this puzzle is the whole issue of fatherless homes. The statistics are mind-blowing.
They really are. Like, did you know that something like 1 in 4 boys in the U.S. are growing up without a father figure in their lives? That's according to the National Fatherhood Initiative. Whether it's their biological dad, a stepdad, or an adoptive father, they're missing that presence. That's a lot of kids.
And to add to that, the U.S. actually has the highest rate of single-parent households in the entire world. And out of those single-parent homes, a crazy 92% of them are headed by single moms. That number has doubled since 1968. When you have a change that big in family structure, it's got to have some serious consequences.
It has to. Scott talked about some research that has some pretty worrying outcomes for people who grow up without fathers.
What really jumps out is that kids from fatherless homes are 3 times more likely to get involved with drugs and crime. And they struggle more with mental health, too. It really shows how important having a dad around can be for a young guy.
Absolutely. But it's important to remember that the reasons behind absent fathers are complicated. It's not always a simple case of the dad choosing to walk away. There's stuff like family court battles, economic pressures, all sorts of things can make it hard for dads to be involved, even if they want to be.
That's a really good point. Even for dads who are trying their best, there are obstacles. Like, think about all the little everyday things that dads do, helping with homework, just chatting with their kids, that garbage time, as they call it. When a dad isn't living at home, those little moments are often lost. And those are the moments that build a strong bond over time.
Yeah, those consistent little interactions are so important. Okay, so let's talk about how boys develop that resilience, that emotional strength. I read about this thing called the orchid versus dandelion theory. What's that all about?
So basically, the theory says that girls are kind of like dandelions. They're tough, they can grow anywhere. Boys, though, they're more like orchids, delicate. They need just the right environment to thrive. It's a way of thinking about how boys and girls might have different sensitivities and how that affects them.
And it's really sad because this difference in resilience can be seen in some pretty devastating statistics. The fact that boys who have been through sexual abuse are 6 to 10 times more likely to commit suicide later in life compared to girls, it's just heartbreaking. You have to wonder if there's a difference in how they process trauma or maybe the support that's available to them.
And that brings up this huge issue of the stigma around male victims. It's been ingrained in us for so long that men have to be strong and tough. And that makes it so hard for them to talk about these experiences and get help.
It's like they're trapped in silence. And we heard from a teacher who talked about seeing more and more young boys in her classes with all this destructive energy. What do you think is behind that?
One thing is really worrying is the possibility that they don't have clear boundaries at home. And on top of that, they have access to the internet, all this stuff online, especially pornography, without any supervision. It can really mess up a young boy's understanding of what's normal and healthy when it comes to relationships. It's like their internal compass is broken.
It's like their whole sense of what's acceptable gets completely warped. Some people have even suggested that maybe boys should start school later, like delaying their education. What's the thinking behind that?
It comes from the fact that boys' schools tend to have a lot more recess, a lot more time for physical activity. They use this analogy saying boys need to be tired like dogs, run around and get all that energy out before they can really focus and learn. So maybe the way classrooms are structured now, with less emphasis on physical activity, it's just not working for some boys, especially when they're younger.
So maybe a more active, less structured environment would be better for them, at least at first. And it's interesting to think about how, for a while, people were almost afraid to talk about how important fathers are for boys. Like they were worried it would reinforce stereotypes or something.
Yeah. For a time, it felt like even bringing up the importance of fathers was seen as a threat to women's progress, like it was implying that dads are better parents or something. But that's not what it's about at all. The reality is boys learn different things from their moms and dads, especially when it comes to stuff like taking risks and pushing boundaries. Those interactions with their dads are crucial. It's not about one being better than the other. It's about both parents bringing something unique and valuable to the table.
Totally agree. Okay, let's talk about the economy for a bit. The video mentions how the whole economic landscape has shifted, and it seems like all the benefits are going to the top 1%. How does that play into all of this, what we're seeing with young men?
Well, there's this idea of a winner-takes-all society, right? It's like we've created a system where a tiny group at the top is doing amazingly well, while everyone else is struggling more and more. Use the example of UCLA, how the acceptance rate is way lower now than it was years ago. It's just an example, but it shows this intense competition for every opportunity. It's not just about getting into a good school, it's everywhere.
It feels like the focus has shifted from trying to create opportunities for a lot of people to just creating a small group of superstars, and everyone else is left behind. And this idea that anyone can make it to that top 1%, it can be really damaging.
It is, because it often leads to this neglect of all the support systems that most people need. If everyone thinks they're just one lucky break away from being rich and famous, then there's less support for policies that would help the majority of people who are facing systemic issues. And this winner-takes-all thing isn't just in the economy, it's in healthcare. Marriage rates are way higher among the top earners. It's everywhere.
It really shows how everything is connected. Okay, so let's talk about something that might surprise some people. The reverse gender pay gap. There's data showing that young women are actually out-earning young men at the beginning of their careers. What's going on there?
Yeah, that graph showing that initial reverse pay gap, it always raises eyebrows because we've been talking about the traditional gender pay gap for so long. But it's important to look at the details. What's really interesting is that things usually change around age 30, and a lot of times that's when women start having kids. The way workplaces are set up now, it just doesn't make it easy for women to keep their careers going strong after they become mothers. That's a big reason why that initial advantage fades away.
And that shift in earning power early on can really affect relationships. It could be contributing to the higher divorce rates, especially if the traditional idea of the man being the breadwinner is still hanging around. It could even mess with a young guy's sense of self-worth, what his role is supposed to be.
And this ties into the whole concept of hypergamy, which basically means that people tend to marry someone of higher social or economic status. Traditionally, it was women marrying men who had more money or a higher position in society. But as women are getting more education, earning more, it creates this mating gap where there might not be enough guys who fit that traditional mold for all these high-achieving women.
So you have more women climbing the economic ladder, but they might not find as many men at the same level. And some projections show that college enrollment is going to get even more lopsided, maybe even 2 women graduating for every 1 man. What happens then?
Well, if that trend continues, it means that a lot of college-educated women, maybe even half of them, might not find a partner who's also college-educated.
Yeah.
And that can force them to change their priorities. If a guy isn't necessarily going to be the main provider, then other qualities become more important. Emotional intelligence, communication skills, those become the valuable things in dating. But the problem is, a lot of guys haven't been raised to focus on those things.
They were told to be the strong, silent type, the provider, and now the rules have changed. And like we talked about, the research suggests that divorce is more likely when the woman makes more money, which can really hit a guy's sense of purpose if he's always seen himself as the provider.
Right. And then we have to talk about dating apps and how they might be making this whole feeling of male exclusion even worse. The fact that something like 75% of women say financial stability is important to them in a partner, while only 25% of men say the same, it really shows you how differently men and women approach dating.
Totally different priorities right from the start. And then you have things like what they call the high heels effect. A lot of women say they don't want to date a guy who's shorter than them. It might seem superficial, but it probably taps into this deeper desire to feel protected, safe.
And these preferences, even though they're personal, they get amplified on dating apps. It's like the way those apps are set up, it creates a situation where women are focusing on a small percentage of men who fit certain criteria, and the rest of the guys are left feeling rejected and invisible.
And the data from apps like Tinder really shows how bad it is. Some reports say an average guy might have to swipe right like 200 times just to get one coffee date. And even then, there's a good chance he'll get ghosted. It's like a constant cycle of rejection, and that can really hurt a guy's self-esteem, make him question his worth.
Yeah, it's brutal. And it's easy to see how that kind of experience could push a guy towards those online communities that try to explain all this. But they offer these simplistic, often misogynistic explanations.
And that feeling of being shut out, it might be contributing to that statistic we talked about. 1 in 7 young men in the UK being neat, not in school, not working, just opting out completely.
It's scary. It's like they're just giving up on society. And Drew brought up some really interesting paradoxes in dating that are adding to all the difficulties. One of them has to do with emotional support.
The thing is, now that women are providers more often, they want emotional support from men. But like we've been saying, a lot of guys haven't been taught how to be emotionally open. It's not something that society has encouraged in men.
Right. And the ways men and women communicate, their expectations, they're just different. Women, from a young age, they're encouraged to talk about their feelings, be emotionally expressive. Men, they're told to suck it up, be stoic.
And that leads to the second paradox. Women say they want men to be more emotionally open, but then when guys actually do it, they sometimes get a negative reaction. That quote you mentioned, a woman would rather see me die on the white horse than fall off of it. It really captures that contradiction.
Yeah, it's this deep-seated expectation that men have to be strong all the time, even when vulnerability is what's being asked for. And that story about the guy whose date ended because he talked about his mom's suicide attempt, it's a perfect example of that disconnect.
It's like there's this gap between what people say they want, like emotional availability, and what they're actually drawn to, which might still be those more traditional masculine traits. It's complicated. And isn't it interesting that when they ask men and women who has more power in relationships, a lot of people say it's the opposite gender?
Yeah. It's like this mutual feeling that the other side has all the power. And it just shows how much misunderstanding there is, how much miscommunication, and probably a lot of unmet expectations on both sides.
So with all these challenges, what can we do? What are some potential solutions, ways to help young men through all this? Drew talked about how positive men's groups can be.
What's so great about men's groups is that they provide a space where guys can connect with each other, support each other, hold each other accountable. It's a masculine environment where they can talk about their struggles. And for a lot of guys, they don't have any other spaces like that in their lives.
And that point about humor being a way to avoid the deeper conversations, it's interesting. It shows that these groups have to be supportive, but they also have to push guys to be vulnerable, to really open up. And romantic relationships can play a big role too.
Yeah. When a guy has a supportive partner, it can really influence his behavior, his ambition, his overall well-being. So that statistic about fewer men under 30 having girlfriends compared to women having boyfriends, but it makes you wonder if those guys are missing out on that positive influence.
Mm.
And the fact that women often date older, more established men, that could be a factor too.
So maybe some young guys are missing that stabilizing force in their lives. And then there's the whole issue of pornography and technology, how that's affecting everything.
It makes you think,
Mm.
is all this easy access to porn actually making people less interested in real relationships? Like, is it making them less motivated to put in the effort to connect with someone in real life? And then you have these no-fap communities popping up, which shows that some guys are trying to fight back against that influence.
And when you think about the future, AI companions, sex robots, it's kind of mind-blowing. How will that affect our desire for real relationships? Will it lead to even fewer births? It's scary to think about.
And this ties into something else that's been observed. Younger daters, Gen Z especially, they seem to have a lower tolerance for rejection. That might be because of the pandemic, all the time spent online, who knows? And this lack of resilience shows up in other areas too, like they have trouble handling criticism at school or at work.
And this might sound strange, but someone brought up the idea that maybe young people drinking less could actually be making it harder to form romantic connections.
Yeah, it sounds weird at first, but the idea is that alcohol can help people loosen up, get over that initial awkwardness when they're meeting someone new. Of course, that goes against all the reasons why people are choosing to be sober or sober curious these days. And it seems like Gen Z overall is less into taking risks.
It's interesting to think about. Scott and Logan gave some really good advice for young guys. Scott talked about focusing on male strengths, getting fit physically and mentally, becoming financially stable, being kind and striving for excellence, and giving people a second chance in dating, going for that second coffee.
And Logan's advice was all about finding your passions, talking about them, having a growth mindset, understanding that it's all about effort, those little things you do consistently to build a connection. He also said that guys often think they have to be perfect from the start, and that's just not true.
And that analogy he used, thinking of yourself as the clothing in your closet and asking yourself if you're something someone would choose to wear, it's a really smart way to get guys to think about self-improvement. We also talked about some of the challenges that successful women are facing in dating.
When you hear about these high-powered women who can't find guys who aren't intimidated by their success, it shows you how much those traditional gender roles are still affecting us.
And the whole single mother by choice thing, where women are choosing to have kids on their own because they can't find the right partner, it's another example. And in some areas, you have more and more people exploring polyamory, which could be a sign that people are rethinking the whole traditional relationship model.
And the role of feminism in all this is a really tough one to unpack. It's been a force for good, no doubt. But some people argue that it's also created some unintended consequences, new challenges for both men and women as we figure out these new roles.
That quote, "You can have it all, just not at the same time," it sums up the conflicting messages that are out there. And for men, their identity has always been so tied to being the provider, the protector, the one who brings home the bacon.
And it seems like more and more, a man's worth, even his sexual attractiveness, is being tied to how much money he makes. And that can clash with the idea of women being financially independent, which is obviously important.
It's like if a guy isn't wealthy, he's lost his value even if he's a good person. And all that pressure, all those feelings of not being good enough, it can really damage mental health.
And you see it in the suicide rates among young men. They're so much higher. And the words they use in their suicide notes, worthless, useless, it breaks your heart. And you can't help but think it's connected to this pressure to be the provider and the feeling of failing at that in a world that's changing so fast.
Drew was saying how many emails they get from young guys who are struggling, and it shows how big this problem is. Is there anything we can do on a larger scale, like systemic solutions that could make a difference?
Well, there are some things to consider, like bringing back vocational training so guys have more options, maybe national service to give them a sense of purpose, making
Mm.
college more affordable, creating more community spaces where people can connect. And we have to acknowledge this lack of empathy for young men that's out there, maybe because of all the advantages that white men have had historically. We need to get past that.
It seems like more and more people are realizing that these problems facing young men aren't just men's problems. They affect all of us. And the fact that even politicians are starting to pay attention, it's a good sign. The conversation is definitely happening more now than it used to.
And we need to make sure guys have access to resources if they're struggling. Support groups, affordable therapy, showcasing positive male role models in media, all that stuff is crucial.
And one last thing, the whole issue of declining birth rates. It's kind of scary that we're at a point where we might have to teach people about the basic instinct to have children. What's happening in South Korea, those numbers are like a warning sign for the rest of the world.
Yeah, so basically we've gone through a lot of different factors that are contributing to the struggles that young men are facing in relationships and just in society in general.
It's a complex web of economics, changing social norms, emotional development, and technology's impact on everything.
So, with all these massive changes happening so fast, what does it even mean to be a man now? What does a healthy partnership look like? Those are questions we all need to think about.
They really are. Thank you for listening to all this. It's a tough subject, but it's important. We hope it's giving you some things to think about. What are your own assumptions about all this? How are these trends playing out in your life and in your community? Goodbye. See you soon.